January 17, 1940. The world was wrapped in a blanket of cold. Across Europe, the winter of 1940 was relentless, a biting chill that seeped into the very bones of every soldier marching through the snow. France, like much of Europe, had already felt the impact of war's destruction. Its villages and fields, once picturesque and tranquil, had become battlefields, lined with trenches and scarred by artillery fire. The air was thick with the smell of burnt wood and wet earth, the kind of scent that clung to everything it touched. In the small, desolate village in northern France, the day was gray, a stark reflection of the uncertainty that hung over the land. The street was nearly empty, save for the soldiers and prisoners who had been marched through it, pale, tired men whose faces had been weathered by months of hardship. These were the prisoners of war, soldiers who had once been part of the powerful German Wehrmacht, but now stood defeated, captured by the Allied forces. They shuffled through the snow-covered streets, their boots crunching loudly against the frozen ground. The bitter wind howled through the village, whipping through their tattered coats, stinging their exposed skin. They had seen and endured more than most could imagine: hunger, bloodshed, terror. But nothing had prepared them for the shock that awaited them as they entered the large stone building ahead, which stood as a reminder of both their defeat and the captivity that lay ahead. Inside the building, the atmosphere was strangely quiet, almost peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. This was a POW camp, a temporary holding facility for prisoners who had been taken during the fighting. There were no sounds of gunfire here, no explosions shaking the earth. Instead, the camp was alive with the quiet murmurings of prisoners adjusting to their new reality. The guards, stoic and efficient, moved about their duties with a sense of detachment. To them, this was just another camp, another group of defeated soldiers. But to the German POWs, this was an unfamiliar world, a world where they were no longer in control, where the only thing that mattered was surviving from one day to the next. As the prisoners moved deeper into the camp, they were led into a large mess hall. It was a room filled with tables and benches, the smell of food already lingering in the air. It wasn't the kind of meal they had expected. In fact, it wasn't even the kind of meal they had hoped for. The rations in POW camps were notoriously meager, and the German soldiers had long become accustomed to eating the bare minimum in order to survive. But what they didn't expect, what they couldn't have prepared for, was the sight that awaited them at the far end of the room. There, on a table covered with a white cloth, were small bowls filled with what looked like ice cream. The prisoners paused, their eyes narrowing as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Ice cream? The cold, creamy dessert that was a symbol of decadence and luxury in their minds? In their world, ice cream was something reserved for the wealthy, a treat that belonged to civilians living in comfort, untouched by the horrors of war. It was something they had never tasted during their time on the front lines, something they had never imagined would be offered to them. For a moment, the prisoners stood frozen, unsure of how to react. Was this some kind of cruel joke? The Americans, their enemies, had often been portrayed as soft, weak, and indulgent. The idea that they would offer something so trivial, something so human, to the very men they had captured seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The smell of vanilla and sugar wafted through the air, mingling with the heavier, more familiar scent of camp rations. It was sweet, inviting, a stark contrast to the sour tang of war that had long been in their mouths. As the prisoners were directed to take their seats and approach the table, they moved hesitantly, as though the act of accepting something so simple could somehow undermine their very identity as soldiers. Each prisoner took a bowl, and as they lifted the spoons to their mouths, the silence in the room deepened. What had been an uncertainty turned into something else, something more profound. The first spoonful was cold, smooth, and unexpected. The creaminess melted across their tongues in a way they had never known before. For a brief moment, the bitterness of war, the hunger and fatigue that had plagued them for months, seemed to fade away. The taste was nothing short of a revelation. One prisoner, later describing the moment, recalled, "I had never tasted anything like it before. It was cold and sweet, but it felt like more than just food. It was like a moment of peace, a moment where everything we had endured, everything we had fought for, no longer mattered. It was just the taste, and for a second, I forgot where I was, and what had happened." The ice cream was not just a treat, it was a symbol of something they had never imagined they would encounter in the midst of war. It represented everything they had been taught to despise: abundance, kindness, generosity. To them, this was the food of the enemy, those they had been raised to view as weak and decadent. Yet here, in the midst of their captivity, it was they who had been offered this luxury. And it wasn't just any ice cream. It was a bowl filled with sweetness, with comfort, and, for the briefest of moments, it offered the promise of a world beyond war, a world they could barely imagine. As the prisoners continued to eat, the emotional contrast began to settle in. What they had expected from their American captors was punishment, deprivation, perhaps even cruelty. They had been taught that the Allies, particularly the Americans, were a soft, disorganized force easily defeated, with no understanding of the realities of war. And yet, here they were, being fed a simple pleasure that seemed to offer nothing but comfort. This moment, though small, was powerful. It was a small gesture of kindness from a people they had been taught to hate. It was a reminder that the Americans, the people they had viewed as weak and indulgent, were not so different from them. In the end, it wasn't just the ice cream they would remember, it was the lesson it imparted, that power could be exercised through kindness, that strength could be shown through generosity. The scene in the mess hall was an unexpected one. The German prisoners, hardened by months of war and deprivation, had never expected their enemies to offer them anything but scorn. And yet, here they were, sharing a moment of humanity, something they would carry with them long after the war had ended. This simple act of sharing ice cream would mark a turning point in their perception of the war and their captors. It would serve as a reminder that, sometimes, it is not the weapons we wield, but the small acts of kindness, that can change the course of a life, or even a war. The moment the ice cream touched their lips, time seemed to stretch. The cold, velvety texture was a sensation that none of the German soldiers could have anticipated. Their hands, stiff from months of exposure to the elements and the constant stress of battle, shook slightly as they held the spoons. The creamy sweetness of the ice cream was unlike anything they had ever tasted during their time on the front lines, far from the harsh, bitter rations they had become accustomed to. For a fleeting moment, the war, the suffering, and the relentless hunger seemed to vanish, replaced by the unexpected luxury of a simple dessert. The room fell into a hushed silence as the prisoners processed what they had just experienced. Some of the men sat still, stunned by the indulgence they had been offered. It was a bizarre moment of contrast, captured soldiers, many of them still in their battle-worn uniforms, sitting in a cold, gray camp mess hall, eating ice cream. The prisoners exchanged hesitant glances, unable to fully comprehend what was unfolding. In the midst of their confusion, some of the men couldn't help but feel a strange sense of guilt. How could they, the victors of the battlefield, accept something so trivial from their enemies? How could they enjoy a comfort that, to them, seemed reserved only for those who had lived a life untouched by the horrors of war? The very act of receiving the ice cream felt like a violation of the hardened sense of pride they had been taught to uphold. But, even as the guilt lingered, there was also something else, something that began to stir within them. It was not just the sweetness of the ice cream that caught their attention, it was the realization that their captors, the Americans, were offering them more than just food. They were offering a rare moment of humanity, a brief respite from the brutality of war. This was not what the German soldiers had expected. The war had taught them to view their enemies as less than human, to see them as obstacles to overcome. They had been raised in an ideology that told them that power was everything, that might, strength, and control were the only virtues worth fighting for. But here they were, sitting in a mess hall, faced with a simple yet profound act of kindness. The Americans, who had been portrayed as weak, decadent, and incapable of enduring hardship, were now showing them something they had never anticipated: generosity, even to their enemies. As each man took another spoonful, the discomfort began to fade. The ice cream, in its simplicity, was starting to break down the barriers of suspicion and resentment. The moment wasn't just about food, it was about the realization that the people on the other side of the war were not as they had been taught to believe. They were human, just like them. They too were capable of kindness, capable of extending compassion to those who had once been their enemies. The prisoners began to reflect on their own beliefs, their own biases, and the propaganda they had swallowed for so long. One young soldier, who had enlisted with the hope of securing a better future for his country, later recalled, "At first, I felt confused. How could the Americans, our enemies, offer us something so simple, so kind? We had been told that they were weak, that they couldn't survive the harshness of war. But here they were, giving us a gift that none of us had expected." And in that moment, I began to wonder if everything I had been told about them, about the war, was wrong. The ice cream had shaken the very foundations of their beliefs. For these soldiers, who had been raised on a steady diet of nationalism and superiority, the act of receiving food from their enemies was more than just an unexpected gesture, it was a powerful statement. It forced them to confront the vast difference between the idealized version of their enemies, as portrayed in Nazi propaganda, and the reality they now faced. The Americans, it turned out, were not the weak, indulgent people they had been made to believe. They were, in fact, stronger than they had imagined, strong enough to offer kindness, even to their captives. As the prisoners finished their bowls, the mood in the mess hall shifted. The tense silence had given way to quiet conversation. The men spoke in hushed tones, but there was an unmistakable sense of reflection in the air. For the first time in their lives, many of these soldiers began to question their role in the war, their country's ideology, and the path they had chosen. The ice cream, a small and seemingly insignificant treat, had forced them to re-evaluate everything they had been taught about strength, power, and honor. The emotional weight of this moment wasn't lost on the soldiers. For many of them, this was the first time they had been faced with the humanity of their captors. The prisoners had always been told that the Americans were the enemy, that they were weak, decadent, and incapable of understanding the realities of war. But now, they had been shown something different, something far more powerful than they had anticipated. The Americans had not just defeated them on the battlefield, they had won them over with compassion, a compassion that made them feel both ashamed and awestruck. In that moment, the prisoners realized that the war was not simply a battle between two nations, it was a battle of ideologies. On one side, there was the belief that power was everything, that strength could be measured in dominance and control. On the other side, there was the belief that true strength came from the ability to show kindness and understanding, even in the face of adversity. And as the German soldiers sat in that mess hall, tasting the sweetness of the ice cream, they began to understand which ideology was truly stronger. But it wasn't just about the war. The ice cream had opened their eyes to something more profound. It had shown them that in every conflict, in every battle, there was always room for humanity, always room for empathy and understanding. In the midst of destruction, it was possible to find a moment of peace, a moment of grace. And in that moment, the soldiers realized that it was these moments, these small acts of kindness, that would ultimately change the course of history. The taste of the ice cream lingered long after the bowls were empty. For the German prisoners, it became more than just a fleeting memory, it became a symbol of the power of humanity, of the strength of compassion in a world ravaged by war. The war would go on, and they would continue to face the brutal realities of captivity. But in that moment, they had been given a glimpse of a world that was not defined by power, but by the simple, profound act of kindness. As the prisoners continued to eat, the sweetness of the ice cream began to stir something deeper within them. It was more than just a momentary indulgence, it was a quiet upheaval, a disruption of everything they had been taught to believe. The German soldiers, who had entered the camp expecting to be treated as enemies, expecting the coldness of captivity and punishment, were instead being treated to something they had never anticipated. The simplicity of it, cold, creamy ice cream, felt like an assault on everything they had been conditioned to understand about power, about war, and about the world outside of their borders. What had begun as confusion soon deepened into something else. The warmth of the ice cream contrasted with the cold air outside, creating a peculiar sense of comfort. The men, their hands trembling from both the chill and the unfamiliarity of the experience, continued to eat slowly, savoring the unexpected pleasure. It was difficult for them to accept this act of kindness from their captors, but as the coldness of their previous lives began to melt away, the soldiers couldn't help but wonder, what kind of people were these Americans? They had been told time and time again that the Allies were weak, disorganized, and soft. Nazi propaganda had painted them as inferior beings, unworthy of respect. But now, here they were, being offered not just any food, but a delicacy, something that spoke not of weakness, but of abundance. The ice cream, with its smooth, rich texture, was a sharp contrast to the bare-bones rations they had been accustomed to. It was the kind of food that seemed to belong to a world untouched by the suffering of war, a world where the struggle for survival didn't dominate every waking moment. As they ate, they glanced around at each other, their expressions a mix of disbelief and introspection. Some of them, older men who had seen the horrors of the First World War, seemed almost lost in thought. Their faces, lined with years of struggle, seemed to soften, if only for a moment. They had lived through the worst that war could offer, but now, in the midst of their captivity, they were being given something so simple, so fundamentally human, that it felt like a betrayal of everything they had been taught. One prisoner, a young man who had enlisted with the full belief that his country was in the right, later recalled, "At first, I couldn't understand it. How could the enemy, who we had been told to hate, offer us something so sweet, so kind? I had been taught that we were superior, that we were fighting for something great. But in that moment, I realized that we had lost something much more important than the war. We had lost our humanity." The emotional weight of the moment was not lost on the men. With each spoonful of ice cream, they were forced to confront the stark contrast between the world they had been raised to believe in and the reality they now found themselves in. The soldiers who had once believed they were fighting for the superiority of the German people were now being shown, in the most unexpected way, that there was another path, a path defined not by power and control, but by compassion and generosity. The American soldiers, standing quietly on the sidelines, watched as their captives hesitated, then slowly began to take the first bites. The act of offering ice cream was, in itself, a small gesture. But its impact was profound. The American soldiers had been raised in a culture that valued kindness, that believed in the inherent worth of every individual, regardless of nationality or circumstance. They saw their prisoners not just as soldiers of the enemy, but as men who had, like them, been swept up in the chaos of war. And in that moment, they chose to offer them something they had been denied for so long, a taste of peace, a brief respite from the horrors of the battlefield. The contrast between the two sides was never more evident. The German soldiers, who had once seen the Americans as weak and unworthy, were now facing a hard truth. The act of sharing ice cream was not just about food, it was about a larger ideology, one that had been forged in the crucible of war. It was a statement that true strength was not found in tanks or weapons, but in the ability to offer kindness, even to your enemies. This shift in perception was not immediate, nor was it universal. Some of the prisoners remained skeptical, unsure of how to reconcile the generosity they had been shown with the hatred they had been taught to feel. For them, the ice cream was simply a fleeting moment, something that would eventually fade away, replaced by the grim realities of war. But for others, the taste of the ice cream was something more. It was a door that had been opened, a door through which they could glimpse a world beyond the battlefield, a world defined not by conflict, but by shared humanity. The transformation was slow, but it had begun. The walls of hatred, which had been built up over years of propaganda and war, started to crack. For the first time, the German soldiers saw their captors as something more than faceless enemies. They saw them as people capable of both strength and kindness, people who could offer comfort, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. And in that realization lay the seeds of change, not just for the prisoners, but for the course of the war itself. The ice cream, once a symbol of excess and indulgence, had become a symbol of something far more important. It represented the ideals of freedom and democracy, the very ideals that the Americans were fighting to protect. It was a small moment, a fleeting exchange of kindness, but in its simplicity, it had the power to change hearts and minds. As the prisoners finished their ice cream, the conversation in the room began to shift. No longer were they talking about the battles they had fought, or the defeats they had suffered. Instead, they began to talk about the world they were now part of, a world where even the enemy could show them compassion. It was an uncomfortable conversation, one that forced them to question their own beliefs, but it was a necessary one. And as the guards moved quietly through the room, ensuring that the prisoners had everything they needed, one couldn't help but wonder, what kind of world would emerge from this war? A world built on the foundation of power and control, or one built on compassion and understanding? The answer was still unclear, but the ice cream, in its quiet simplicity, had given them all a glimpse of what could be. As the last of the ice cream was consumed, the room fell into an uneasy silence. The once wary, uncertain prisoners now sat quietly, each lost in their own thoughts. The sweet, cold sensation that had flooded their senses moments before now felt like a distant memory, leaving behind a lingering warmth, an unexpected, emotional warmth that they were not prepared for. As they looked around at one another, there was a palpable shift. The act of receiving the ice cream, so simple and human, had triggered something far deeper than a momentary indulgence. It had opened a door, one they hadn't known existed, to a broader understanding of their situation, their captors, and the war itself. It was as though the ice cream had created a brief window in time, where the harsh realities of war had momentarily been suspended, and the prisoners were allowed a fleeting glimpse of a world beyond the battlefield. In that world, they saw something they had never expected to witness: compassion. Kindness. A kind of strength that wasn't rooted in fear, dominance, or military might, but in the willingness to extend a hand to those who had been deemed enemies. The German prisoners, once stoic and hardened by months of deprivation and warfare, now looked at their American captors with a new kind of curiosity. They had been trained to see the enemy as something less than human, an obstacle to their country's greatness, a target to be defeated. But now, sitting in the mess hall of this American POW camp, with the taste of the cold, creamy ice cream still lingering on their tongues, the walls of that perception began to crack. The American soldiers, who had once been their enemies, were now something different. They were men, not so different from themselves. The prisoners saw that beneath the uniforms, the weapons, and the power structures, they shared something universal: humanity. One of the prisoners, a young soldier who had enlisted at the beginning of the war with the belief that Germany was destined for victory, later recalled, "I remember sitting there after I finished my ice cream, looking at the Americans. I had been told that they were weak, that they were decadent. But now, I realized something. They were just like us, fighting to survive, fighting for their own beliefs. They were no different from us." It was a realization that I couldn't ignore. This moment, though small in the grand scheme of the war, represented a profound shift. The simple gesture of offering ice cream was, in essence, a moment of vulnerability, a break from the rigid, dehumanizing narrative that had been imposed on both sides. For the German soldiers, this moment was the first crack in the facade of the enemy they had been taught to despise. For the American soldiers, it was a reminder of their own capacity for compassion, and the belief that kindness could triumph over hate, even in the midst of war. As the prisoners continued to reflect on their experience, it became clear that the impact of the ice cream went beyond the immediate pleasure of its taste. The sweetness of the treat had dulled the sharpness of the world they had come to know. They had been taught to fight for a cause that valued power above all else. But here, in the stillness of the camp, they were being shown a different way, a way where strength was measured not in domination, but in the ability to offer peace, to offer comfort, even to those who were once considered enemies. The change wasn't instantaneous. It couldn't be. Years of indoctrination, of belief in the superiority of their cause, couldn't be undone by a single act of kindness. But the ice cream had planted a seed, one that would grow slowly, quietly, over time. And for many of the prisoners, the moment they tasted that ice cream marked the beginning of a profound transformation. For some of them, the transformation was personal. One soldier, a young man who had been an idealist when he joined the army, reflected on how his views had shifted. Before the war, I believed that we were fighting for something greater. We were fighting for the future of our people, for our beliefs. But after everything we had been through, after everything I saw in that camp, I began to wonder if we had been fighting for the wrong reasons. That ice cream, it wasn't just a food. It was a reminder that we were all human. And I think that was the turning point for me. The soldiers had been taught to believe that their cause was just, that they were part of a larger mission to reshape the world. But in that mess hall, surrounded by the simple comfort of ice cream, they began to question everything they had been told. They had once believed that their enemies were inferior, that the world they fought for was the only one worth fighting for. But the kindness shown by their American captors, their willingness to offer something so small, yet so deeply human, began to challenge that belief. As the war raged on, the German prisoners began to see the ice cream for what it truly was, a symbol. It was a symbol of the values that the Americans were fighting for, values of compassion, generosity, and dignity. The ice cream, in its humble sweetness, was a reminder that there was more to life than power and conquest. It represented a world where people could treat each other with kindness, regardless of their allegiances, regardless of their past actions. It was a world where survival wasn't just about fighting to win, but about finding humanity even in the darkest of times. In the days that followed, the prisoners were given more opportunities to reflect on what had happened. They were not just being held captive, they were being forced to confront the reality of their own beliefs, their own actions. And the ice cream, though seemingly trivial, had played a crucial role in that process. It had opened their eyes to the fact that there was another way, another path that led to peace, not through domination, but through understanding and empathy. As they continued to reflect on their experiences, the prisoners began to share their thoughts with each other. Some were reluctant to accept the lessons that the ice cream had offered. Some were too ingrained in their own beliefs to question them. But for others, the moment had planted a seed of doubt, a doubt that would continue to grow as they spent more time in captivity. The seed had been planted, and it would eventually sprout, leading them down a path toward a new understanding of themselves, their captors, and the war they were caught up in. In the weeks and months that followed, the American soldiers continued to offer small acts of kindness to their prisoners. Whether it was food, a kind word, or the occasional small comfort, these gestures continued to chip away at the walls of hatred that had been built between the two sides. The soldiers, both American and German, were learning that there was more to war than just fighting. There was also the potential for healing, for growth, and for understanding. And it was in these small moments, these seemingly insignificant acts of kindness, that the true power of humanity began to shine through. As the days turned into weeks, the German prisoners found themselves living in a new reality, one that was both foreign and uncomfortable. They had expected to be broken, humiliated, and forced to accept their defeat with bitterness. Instead, they were given something that none of them had anticipated, the chance to reconsider everything they had been taught, everything they had believed in. The simple act of sharing ice cream had broken down barriers that had been built over years of propaganda, ideology, and hate. Some of the soldiers resisted the shift, of course. The weight of their training, the indoctrination that had defined their identities, was not so easily undone. They had been taught to believe in the superiority of their cause, that they were fighting for the future of the German people, for a vision of the world that promised power and dominance. But now, sitting in the cold light of captivity, faced with the generosity of their captors, these beliefs began to unravel, thread by thread. It wasn't just the ice cream, it was the recognition that their enemies were not the faceless, inferior beings they had been led to believe. The Americans, in that simple moment, had shown them that true strength didn't come from violence or oppression, but from kindness, understanding, and empathy. For the majority of the prisoners, the ice cream marked the beginning of a long, quiet transformation. They began to question their own role in the war, and more importantly, the system that had encouraged them to fight. It was as though the veil had been lifted, and they could suddenly see their world for what it was, one built on fear, manipulation, and the pursuit of power. But in the small, unexpected act of sharing food, they began to see another world, a world where people could fight not for domination, but for the right to live freely and compassionately. One of the prisoners, an officer who had once led men into battle with unwavering confidence, recalled the shift in his own thinking. After everything we had been through, after all the battles, the victories, the defeats, I began to understand something. This war wasn't about saving a people or a culture, it was about control. And the Americans, they weren't fighting for control. They were fighting for something greater. Something I hadn't seen before. The transformation wasn't just personal, it was collective. As the days passed, the prisoners began to talk openly about their experiences, about the kindness they had been shown. They spoke less of war and more of the simple things, the things they had never considered before, such as the power of kindness in shaping the course of history. The walls between the prisoners and their captors slowly began to erode, replaced by a quiet respect that had not existed before. The ice cream, once a symbol of excess and indulgence, had become a symbol of something far more important. It represented the core of what the Allied forces were fighting for, a world where power was not derived from fear, but from the ability to show compassion even to your enemies. It was a small, fleeting moment of peace in the midst of war, but it had a profound effect on the soldiers who had experienced it. In a world consumed by hatred and destruction, it reminded them that, even in the darkest of times, humanity could still shine through. As the war continued, the memories of that day, the taste of the ice cream, the kindness shown by their captors, remained with the prisoners long after the conflict had ended. Many of the men who had been held in captivity would return to their homes, but they would never forget what they had learned during their time as prisoners of war. The ice cream had become a symbol of the possibility for change, a reminder that even in the most trying circumstances, there was always room for growth, for understanding, and for peace. Years later, long after the war had ended and the world had begun to rebuild, the former prisoners often found themselves reflecting on that moment. It was a moment that, in many ways, had defined their understanding of humanity. The ice cream had been a small thing, a simple indulgence, but it had represented something far larger, the possibility of a better world, a world where people could choose compassion over cruelty, where kindness could break through the hardest of hearts. In the years following the war, many of the former prisoners would tell their children and grandchildren about that day, the day when, in the midst of defeat, they had tasted something sweeter than victory. The taste of the ice cream had become a metaphor, a powerful symbol of the lesson they had learned in captivity, that the true measure of a person, a country, or an ideology, is not found in its ability to wield power, but in its capacity to show compassion and humanity, even in the most challenging times. The ice cream had become a lasting memory for all who had shared it, a memory that transcended borders, nations, and ideologies. It was a reminder that even in the darkest hours of human history, there are moments of grace, moments that allow us to see each other not as enemies, but as fellow human beings. And in those moments, we are reminded that, no matter where we come from, we all share something deeper, something more enduring, our humanity. As the world continued to change, as nations rebuilt and redefined themselves, the lesson from that small act of kindness remained a powerful force. The German prisoners who had tasted the ice cream carried its memory with them for the rest of their lives. They had been given a glimpse of a better world, one where kindness, compassion, and understanding triumphed over the forces of hatred and destruction. And that, in the end, was the true victory, not the victory of war, but the victory of humanity.